December 1241. The Danube River has frozen solid. For months, the mighty river has been the only thing standing between the Mongol army and the western half of Hungary. Now, nothing separates them. Batu Khan tests the ice by leaving horses on the eastern bank. When Hungarian defenders cross over to capture them, he knows. The ice will hold. Within days, tens of thousands of Mongol horsemen sweep across the frozen river. Villages burn. Towns fall. The unstoppable conquerors who have raised. Everything from Beijing to Baghdad are now loose in the heart of Europe. But then something happens that hasn't happened before. Something the Mongols don't expect. They reach the city of Esztergom, the political and religious capital of Hungary. Using their Chinese siege engines, they bombard the walls day and night. The wooden towers collapse. The suburbs burn. Everything seems to be going according to plan, except the Citadel on the hill. That stone fortress, perched on a rocky outcrop, refuses to fall. Days turn into weeks. The Mongols throw everything at it. Nothing works. For the first time in their westward campaign, Batu Khan is forced to give up and move on. At Székesfehérvár, the same thing happens. The siege engines that demolished Russian cities can't bring down these Hungarian walls. At the monastery of St. Martin of Pannonia, again the Mongols withdraw without victory. Something has changed. The weapons and tactics that conquered half the world have met their match. Not another army. Not better cavalry, stone walls on high ground. In this video, you'll discover why Mongol siege warfare dominated everywhere from China to Poland, but failed in Hungary. You'll learn about the architectural differences that made European castles nearly impossible for the Mongols to take. And you'll see how King Bela IV turned his traumatized kingdom into a fortress that would never fall again. This is the story of how engineering defeated the greatest military machine the medieval world had ever seen. How stone walls and crossbows became the weapons that saved Europe. And how one king's vision transformed his entire kingdom into an impregnable fortress. Because while everyone talks about the Battle of Mohi, the real turning point of the Mongol invasion wasn't a battle at all. It was a siege that never succeeded. Let's start with understanding exactly what the Mongols were facing and why it was so different from anything they'd encountered before. To understand why Hungarian castles stopped the Mongols, we need to understand what the Mongols had faced everywhere else, and that starts in China. When Genghis Khan began his conquests in the early 1200s, he faced a serious problem. The Mongols were masters of the open field. Horse archers, mobile warfare, psychological terror. But cities, fortifications, that was different. The Jin dynasty in northern China had massive cities protected by walls of rammed earth, some stretching 10 meters high and equally thick. Early Mongol armies simply couldn't take them. They'd surround a city, cut off supplies, and hope starvation did the work. It was slow, inefficient, and tied down too many troops. So the Mongols did what they always did when they encountered something they couldn't handle. They learned, they adapted, and they found experts. Chinese engineers, some willing, many captured, taught the Mongols the secrets of siege warfare. The most important weapon they acquired was the traction trebuchet, what medieval sources sometimes call a mangonel. Here's how it worked. A large wooden arm pivots on a frame. On one end sits a sling holding the projectile, a stone, a pot of burning material, or even a dead animal to spread disease. On the other end, dozens of ropes. Teams of men, sometimes 50 or 60, pull the ropes in coordinated motion. The arm whips forward and the projectile flies. These machines had major advantages. They were relatively quick to build from local timber. They could be disassembled and moved with the army. And they could fire rapidly, maybe 10 shots per hour, creating a sustained bombardment that would terrify defenders and gradually wear down fortifications. Against rammed earth walls, they were devastating. The repeated impacts would shake the compacted soil, create cracks, eventually bring down whole sections. Wooden palisades didn't stand a chance. One good hit could shatter a wooden gate or tower. The Mongols became experts at using these weapons. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, Mongol armies had refined their siege techniques across dozens of campaigns. They knew how to position the machines for maximum effect, how to screen them with bundles of sticks so defenders couldn't target the crews, how to coordinate artillery bombardment with assault tactics. When they swept into Russia and Ukraine in 1237, they brought this experience with them. And Russian cities, with their wooden walls and earthwork defenses, fell like dominoes. Vladimir, Suzdal, Ryazan, Moscow. The pattern repeated. Mongol armies would surround the city, set up their trebuchets, and unleash hell. Stone projectiles would crash through wooden towers. Incendiary devices would set buildings ablaze. Within days, sometimes hours, the defenses would collapse. Kiev, the greatest city of the Rus, fell in December 1240 after a siege that lasted only days. The Mongols had become a siege warfare machine, as unstoppable behind walls as they were on the open steppe. But here's what's crucial to understand. Everything the Mongols had conquered so far, from China to Russia, had certain features in common. The walls were either rammed earth, wood, or a combination. The settlements were often in relatively flat terrain, or at least accessible to siege engines. And the defenders, while brave, didn't have weapons that could seriously threaten armored Mongol assault troops from long range. Hungary was about to be different. Very different. The Kingdom of Hungary in 1241 had been Christian for over 2 centuries. During that time, it had absorbed architectural and military knowledge from both Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire. Hungarian nobles and churchmen had been building in stone. Not everywhere, but in key locations. And the geography was different, too. Western Hungary, beyond the Danube, was more rugged. Hills, rocky outcrops, and higher elevations were common, perfect for defensive positions. The Mongols were about to discover that. Stone walls on hilltops were an entirely different challenge from wooden palisades on flat ground, and that the weapons defending those walls, particularly the crossbow, were more dangerous than anything they'd faced. The stage was set for a confrontation between the unstoppable force of Mongol siege warfare and the immovable object of European stone castle architecture. And it would all come to a head at a city on a hill called Esztergom. Early January 1242. Batu Khan's army has just crossed the frozen Danube. The eastern half of Hungary is a wasteland. Now it's time to finish the job. Esztergom isn't just any city. It's the seat of the Hungarian archbishop, the coronation site of kings, the political and spiritual heart of the kingdom. If Batu can take Esztergom, he breaks the spine of Hungarian resistance. The Mongol army approaches the city with confidence. They've done this dozens of times, hundreds of times. There's no reason to think this will be any different. According to Master Roger, a churchman who witnessed the siege, the Mongols began their attack in their usual fashion. They drove Hungarian prisoners forward to build a screen of bundled sticks and earth in front of the moat. This protected their siege engines from enemy projectiles. Then they brought up 30 trebuchets. 30. That's an enormous concentration of firepower. For comparison, a major siege in Western Europe might involve 5 or 6 such machines. The bombardment began. Day and night, stones crashed into Esztergom. The wooden towers that protected the outer walls were smashed to splinters. The gates were destroyed. Buildings inside the city caught fire from incendiary devices. The defenders of the lower city, the civilian population, and whatever garrison protected the suburbs knew they couldn't hold. They made a desperate decision: destroy everything of value rather than let it fall to the Mongols. They set fire to the suburbs themselves, killed their own horses, buried gold and silver, burned fine fabrics and goods. Then they retreated up the hill to the Citadel, the stone fortress that crowned the rocky outcrop overlooking the city. Batu watched the city burn. He was furious. The Mongols hadn't come this far to watch their plunder go up in smoke. But his rage was about to turn to frustration, because that citadel on the hill, it wasn't going to fall. The Citadel of Esztergom was built on a naturally defensible position, a steep hill with a rocky summit. The approach was difficult. There was no easy way to bring siege engines close enough to be effective, and the walls themselves were stone, thick stone, built to last. But the Mongols tried. They built wooden palisades around the base of the hill to trap the defenders. They attempted assaults up the slopes. They positioned their trebuchets to try to hit the walls. Nothing worked. Here's why. The traction trebuchet, for all its advantages, has limitations. Its range is shorter than a counterweight trebuchet, and its accuracy decreases with distance. When you're trying to hit a target on top of a hill, from below, you're already at a disadvantage. The angle is wrong. The projectiles either fall short, hitting the hillside, or sail over the walls harmlessly. And if you try to move the machines closer up the slope, you lose the level ground needed to operate them effectively. But there was another problem the Mongols hadn't faced before. The defenders of Esztergom had a commander named Simon, described as a Spaniard, who organized a formidable defense. Medieval sources mention that Simon had skilled ballistari. This word can mean two things: crossbowmen, or operators of defensive artillery like ballistas. Probably both. Crossbows were the high-tech weapons of medieval Europe. A crossbow could punch through armor at ranges that would surprise even experienced steppe warriors. It took time to reload, yes, but from behind stone walls, with multiple shooters in rotation, crossbowmen could create a deadly field of fire. If the Mongols tried to storm the walls with scaling ladders, crossbow bolts would cut them down. If they tried to move siege engines closer, the crews would be targeted. And if Simon had defensive artillery, ballistas, or small catapults, he could target the Mongol machines themselves. For weeks, Batu tried. For weeks, the citadel held. Finally, he gave up. He couldn't afford to tie down his entire army at one fortress indefinitely. There were other targets, other cities to take. But before leaving, Batu made a gesture that reveals his fury. 300 women from the citadel came out, dressed in their finest clothes, to beg for mercy. Batu had them robbed, stripped, and beheaded. The message was clear. Defiance would be punished. But the larger message was even clearer. The citadel still stood. The Mongols had failed. And this wasn't an isolated incident. At Székesfehérvár, another major Hungarian city, the pattern repeated. The Mongols destroyed everything outside the walls. But the fortifications held. The garrison, possibly Knights Hospitaller, had built their own siege engines. They could shoot back. And the marshy ground around the city was starting to thaw with the approach of spring, making siege operations even more difficult. After only a few days, the Mongols moved on. At the monastery of St. Martin of Pannonia, the same story. The Mongols surrounded it, tried to take it, failed, and withdrew. Master Roger, writing as an eyewitness, makes a crucial observation. He states that Esztergom, Székesfehérvár, and St. Martin were the only 3 fortified sites that successfully resisted when the Mongols laid siege to them. 3 sites. Out of how many? Dozens, hundreds. But these 3 had something in common. Stone fortifications on defensible positions. This raises a critical question. Why couldn't the Mongols take these castles when they'd taken so many others? The answer lies in understanding what made European stone castles of this period so formidable, and why they were fundamentally different from anything the Mongols had encountered before. If you're finding this story interesting, take a second to drop a like. It helps the channel more than you'd think, and there's a lot more to come. Now, let's talk about why stone castles were such a problem for the Mongols. Think about the fortifications the Mongols had conquered before Hungary. In China, massive walls of rammed earth. In Central Asia, mud, brick and adobe. In Russia, wooden palisades with earthwork ramparts. All of these could be broken down with sustained bombardment from traction trebuchets. Rammed earth cracks and crumbles, mud brick shatters, wood splinters and burns. But stone is different. Specifically, the kind of stone construction used in European castles in the 13th century. These weren't just piles of rocks. European masons had spent centuries perfecting the art of building with stone. The walls of major castles were typically constructed with a core of rubble and mortar, faced on both sides with carefully cut stone blocks. The outer facing provided smooth, hard surfaces that could deflect projectiles. The rubble core absorbed impact by distributing force throughout the wall, and the mortar, made from lime, sand, and water, hardened into something nearly as strong as the stone itself. A wall built this way could be 2 to 3 meters thick, sometimes more. When a stone projectile from a traction trebuchet hit such a wall, it might chip the facing, create some damage, but it wasn't bringing the wall down. Not quickly. Maybe not at all. To seriously damage a stone wall, you need either overwhelming, sustained bombardment from very large machines, or you need to undermine the foundations. The Mongols were experts at both techniques, but in Hungary, circumstances prevented them from using either effectively. The hilltop positions of castles like Esztergom meant that mining, digging tunnels under the walls to collapse them was nearly impossible. You'd be digging through solid rock, and positioning siege engines for sustained close-range bombardment was equally difficult on sloped terrain. But there's another factor that often gets overlooked. The Mongol army in Hungary in 1242 wasn't the same force that had crossed the Carpathian Mountains a year earlier. They'd been campaigning for 6 years straight, from the Volga to Poland to Hungary. They'd fought major battles at the Sajó River, taken dozens of cities, and lost men to disease, desertion, and combat. Some of their Chinese engineers may have died or been lost. Their siege equipment had been used hard and needed constant repair and replacement, and they were operating thousands of kilometers from their supply base. More importantly, 2 Mongol princes, Guyuk and Mungki, had left the campaign in 1240 after a falling out with Batu. They took their forces with them, perhaps 20,000 men, maybe more. The Mongol army besieging Esztergom was still formidable, but it was depleted, tired, and facing a type of fortification that required more time and resources than they could afford to invest. And then there were the crossbows. Medieval Europeans believed crossbows were particularly effective against the Mongols. This belief became so widespread after 1241 that it shows up in numerous sources. But why? Mongol warriors typically wore lighter armor than European knights. Padded coats, sometimes leather, occasionally lamellar armor made of small plates. This was perfect for the steppe, where mobility was everything. But it offered less protection than the full mail suits of European heavy cavalry. A crossbow bolt, fired from close range, could penetrate most Mongol armor. And crossbows had another advantage. They didn't require years of training like the Mongol composite bow. A peasant could be taught to use a crossbow effectively in weeks. From behind stone walls, crossbowmen could create a killing zone. Mongol troops trying to storm the walls or operate siege equipment were exposed. The bolts came fast, accurate, and deadly. This combination, stone walls on high ground defended by crossbows, created a tactical problem the Mongols hadn't solved. They could surround the castle, they could cut off supplies and hope for starvation. But that took time. Months, maybe years, for a well-supplied fortress. And Batu didn't have years. Every week spent at Esztergom was a week his army wasn't, conquering new territory, securing new pastures for their horses, or collecting plunder. The entire Mongol military system depended on constant movement and rapid conquest. Static siege warfare tied them down in ways that fundamentally undermined their operational advantages. There's evidence the Mongols recognized this problem. After the withdrawal from Hungary, when Mongol armies later besieged the Song dynasty city of Xiangyang in China in the 1260s and 70s, they brought in Muslim engineers who built counterweight trebuchets, massive machines far more powerful than the traction trebuchets. These new weapons could hurl heavier projectiles over longer ranges with devastating accuracy. Xiangyang, which had resisted for years, fell within weeks once these superweapons arrived. But in Hungary in 1242, the Mongols didn't have these weapons. They had their tried-and-true traction trebuchets, perfect for most fortifications, but insufficient for European stone castles on hilltops. By March 1242, Batu made a decision. The campaign in Hungary was over. Time to withdraw. The reasons for this withdrawal are still debated. The death of the great Khan Ogedei back in Mongolia, environmental pressures, the difficulty of the sieges. Probably all of these factors played a role. But one thing is certain. The Mongols left without conquering Western Hungary. Those stone castles and the men defending them had stopped the westward advance of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. For King Bela IV, hiding on an island in the Adriatic, this was the miracle he'd prayed for. But he knew something the rest of Europe didn't fully grasp yet. The Mongols would be back. And when they returned, Hungary needed to be ready. Bela returned to his devastated kingdom with a single obsession: turn Hungary into a fortress that could never be overrun again. And over the next 30 years, that's exactly what he did. Summer 1242. King Bela IV rides back into his kingdom. What he sees breaks his heart. East of the Danube, the Hungarian plain is a graveyard. Villages burned to ash, fields unharvested, bodies lying unburied, survivors emerging from forests like ghosts, starving, traumatized, telling stories of horror. Archaeological evidence confirms what the chronicles report. Settlements excavated across eastern Hungary show destruction layers from this period. Burned buildings, mass graves, coins and jewelry buried in hoards that were never recovered because their owners died. Population estimates vary, but historians generally agree that eastern Hungary lost between 25% and 50% of its population. Some regions were completely depopulated, but Bela doesn't have time to mourn, because he knows with absolute certainty that the Mongols will return. They always return. That's what empires do. And next time, Hungary needs to be ready. Bela's solution was radical, expensive, and completely transformed his kingdom. He would turn Hungary into a network of stone fortresses. Not just a few castles for nobles, but a comprehensive defensive system that covered the entire realm. The centerpiece of this system was the Danube River. If the Mongols came from the east again, the Danube would be the first line of defense. But a river alone isn't enough. You need fortified positions along it, positions that can't be taken even if the river freezes. Bela started with Margaret Island, that long island in the middle of the Danube between Buda and Pest. Before the invasion, it had been called the Island of Rabbits, a quiet place with a few religious buildings. Bela transformed it into a fortified complex. At the northern end, a castle for the archbishop. At the southern end, a fortress for the Knights of St. John, a military order. In between, a Dominican monastery for women, where Bela's daughter Margaret would live out her life as a nun, fulfilling a vow Bela had made during his flight from the Mongols. But these weren't just religious buildings. They were strong points, defensive positions that could control movement along the Danube and provide refuge for the population of Buda and Pest if the Mongols returned. To the north, Bela fortified Visegrad. This became one of the most impressive castle complexes in Hungary. Two castles, actually. A lower castle by the river to control the Danube passage, and an upper castle on the hilltop as a refugium, a place of last resort. The upper castle at Visegrad was built specifically with the Mongol threat in mind. High walls, strong towers, accessible only by steep paths. It was designed to be the place where the nuns of Margaret Island, including Bela's daughter, could flee if the Mongols besieged Budapest. Even further north, Esztergom was rebuilt and strengthened. The citadel that had resisted in 1242 was expanded and improved. This city, which had proven it could withstand a Mongol siege, became a cornerstone of the defensive line. And to the south, Buda itself was transformed. Before the invasion, Buda had been an unfortified town. After 1242, Bela built it into a fortified city with strong walls and a castle on the hill. This would eventually become the capital of the Hungarian kingdom, chosen specifically for its defensive position. Together, these fortifications created a defensive line along the Danube. If the Mongols crossed the river, they'd face a series of fortified positions, each one capable of holding out for weeks or months. But Bela didn't. Stop there! He needed fortifications across the entire kingdom. The problem? Building stone castles is expensive. Very expensive. Most of his nobles couldn't afford it, and Bela's own treasury was nearly empty after the invasion. So Bela came up with an innovative solution. He would grant land, lots of land, to nobles on one condition. They had to build a stone castle on it. This created a win-win situation. Nobles got wealthy estates, expanding their power and prestige. But in exchange, they had to invest in defensive infrastructure that protected not just themselves, but the entire kingdom. The result was a castle-building boom unlike anything Hungary had seen before. In the 30 years following the invasion, more stone castles were built in Hungary than in the previous 2 centuries combined, and these weren't just copied from Western European designs. Hungarian castle builders learned specific lessons from 1241. They favored hilltop positions. They made walls thicker. They paid special attention to water supply and food storage, ensuring castles could withstand long sieges. They also incorporated Mongol fighting features, wider fields of fire for crossbowmen, better protected gates, multiple rings of walls to create defense in depth. Bela even brought in military experts from across Europe. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers were given lands and resources to build their own fortifications. These military orders had experience fighting in the Holy Land, and they brought knowledge of the latest military architecture. The transformation was remarkable. A visitor to Hungary in 1270 would have seen a completely different landscape than in 1240. Where once there had been scattered wooden fortifications, now stone castles crowned nearly every significant hill. But Bela's fortress strategy wasn't just about buildings, it was about people and alliances. He brought the Cumans back, those nomadic warriors who had fled Hungary after their leader was murdered in 1241. Bela offered them lands in the now depopulated Great Hungarian Plain, the very region the Mongols would have to cross to invade again. The Cumans became Hungary's early warning system and first line of defense. Skilled horsemen who knew steppe warfare, they could scout, skirmish, and slow down a Mongol invasion, buying time for the population to reach the castles. Bela also built a network of marriage alliances. His daughters married into the ruling families of Poland, Bohemia, and Bavaria. His son married a Cuman princess. These weren't just diplomatic niceties. They were military pacts, ensuring that if the Mongols returned, Hungary wouldn't stand alone. And Bela maintained diplomatic contact with the Mongol Empire itself. He received their envoys, responded to their letters, and carefully managed the relationship. Some historians believe he may have paid some form of tribute to avoid immediate attack, buying precious time to complete his fortifications. Whether that's true or not, the strategy worked. The Mongols didn't return in the 1240s, or the 1250s, or the 1260s, but they did return eventually. And when they did, they would discover that Hungary had become exactly what Bela intended, a fortress kingdom. We're getting close to the end, but there's a crucial part of the story left. If you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. There's new content here every week exploring stories like this. Now let's see if Bela's castle system actually worked. Over 40 years since the first Mongol invasion, King Bela has been dead for 15 years. His son Istvan ruled and died. Now Istvan's son, Laszlo IV, sits on the throne, and the Mongols are coming back. This time, the invasion is led by a Mongol general named Nogai, one of the most powerful figures in the Golden Horde. He's been expanding Mongol control in the Balkans, and now he's decided to finish what Batu started: conquer Hungary. But this isn't 1241. Hungary isn't the same kingdom, and the Mongols are about to find that out. When Nogai's army crosses into Hungary, they immediately encounter the Cumans. The same people who had fled Hungary in 1241 are now its frontline defenders. They harass the Mongol advance, forcing them to fight for every kilometer. The Cumans can't stop the invasion. They're outnumbered. But they're doing what they're supposed to do: slow the enemy down. Give civilians time to reach the castles. Force the Mongols to expend resources on small battles before they even reach major targets. As the Mongol army pushes deeper into Hungary, they start seeing the castles. Everywhere, on every hill, every strategic position, stone fortresses that weren't there 40 years ago. Nogai makes a strategic decision. He won't waste time on prolonged sieges. His army sweeps through the countryside, taking what plunder they can, but avoiding the major fortifications. Some castles are besieged, but the pattern from 1241 repeats. The Mongols can devastate the surrounding countryside, but taking stone castles on hilltops proves too difficult and time-consuming. Contemporary accounts suggest the Mongols were shocked by the transformation of Hungary. Where they expected to find easy targets, they found fortresses. Where they expected to crush peasants in open fields, they found empty countryside with the population safe behind walls. The invasion lasted several months, but it never achieved its objectives. Nogai's army eventually withdrew. Hungary had survived. The second Mongol invasion was less destructive than the first, partly because the Mongols couldn't penetrate the castle system Bela had created. The fortifications worked exactly as intended. This wasn't luck. This was the result of a decades-long, kingdom-wide military project. Bela had learned the lessons of 1241 and applied them systematically. He'd turned his realm into a fortress that even the Mongols couldn't crack. And the impact of this transformation went far beyond Hungary. Other European kingdoms watched and learned. The effectiveness of stone castles against nomadic armies became accepted wisdom. From Poland to Croatia to Austria, rulers invested in stone fortifications. The architectural landscape of Central Europe was permanently changed by the Mongol invasions. If you travel through Hungary, Slovakia, or Romania today, you'll see the legacy. Castles on hilltops, many of them built or strengthened in the decades after 1241. Some are ruins now. Others have been restored. But they stand as monuments to a simple truth. When the greatest military machine of the medieval world met European castle architecture, the castles won. This wasn't about better soldiers or superior tactics. Both sides had brave warriors and skilled commanders. It was about technology, about engineering, about understanding that sometimes the best defense isn't an army in the field, but walls that can't be broken. The Mongol Empire would continue to exist for centuries, ruling vast territories across Asia, but they never conquered Europe. And one of the main reasons was that they never solved the problem of the European stone castle. Later, Mongol armies would acquire better siege equipment. They'd develop the counterweight trebuchet and other advanced weapons. But by then, the moment had passed. Europe had fortified, the kingdoms had learned, and the window of opportunity closed. Bela IV is remembered in Hungary as the second founder of the kingdom. The first was Saint Stephen, who converted the Magyars to Christianity in the year 1000. The second was Bela, who saved the kingdom from destruction and rebuilt it stronger than before. His legacy is written in stone, literally, in the castles that still dot the Hungarian landscape, in the defensive networks that became models for other kingdoms, in the proof that sometimes survival depends not on defeating your enemy in battle, but on making yourself too difficult to conquer. The Mongols taught medieval Europe a hard lesson in 1241. But Europe learned that lesson, adapted, and survived. And at the heart of that survival were the fortifications, the engineering, and the vision of a king who understood that walls could be weapons. And that's the story of how castle architecture stopped the Mongol advance. If you made it this far, thank you. Seriously, these deep dives take a lot of research, and knowing people watch to the end makes it worthwhile. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel. Every week, there's new content exploring the fascinating intersections of history, technology, and human ingenuity. Next time, we'll look at another moment when engineering changed the course of history, something equally unexpected and equally fascinating. Leave a comment. Did you know about Bela's castle building program? Have you visited any of these Hungarian fortresses? And what other historical topics do you want to see covered? Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields. They're won by builders, engineers, and rulers with enough vision to see what needs to be done and the will to do it. Thanks for watching.